Have you ever felt like you gave everything you had to someone only to be treated as if you never existed? As if every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every penny saved with sweat was simply wiped from the story? If this sounds familiar, then this story will strike you deeply. Margaret Maggie Carter, a 73-year-old retired nurse and devoted mother, sacrificed her entire life for her twin children. And this wasn't symbolic. She literally gave up her own retirement to fund her children's dreams, expecting only something basic in return: acknowledgement and gratitude. But what did she get? An impersonal invitation to a lavish celebration where her name wasn't even mentioned as part of building that empire. A deliberate attempt to erase her from the narrative. But Maggie isn't the kind of woman who lets invisibility go unanswered. What started as a gesture of disregard will end in confrontation, truth, and justice. She doesn't want money. She wants what was always hers by right: recognition. Get ready. This is a story of family betrayal, late empowerment, and a legacy that no one will dare erase again. A journey where truth, even when buried, always finds a way to surface. Maggie Carter was sipping her morning tea when the envelope arrived. Thick, golden paper, too elegant to be casual. Inside was an opulent invitation, a celebration of the 5-year anniversary of Horizon Innovations, the company started by her twins, Ethan and Emily. But something was wrong. The name at the top wasn't Mom or Margaret Carter. It said M. Carter, as if she were just any client. The coldness of that detail hurt more than any physical wound. It wasn't a simple mistake, it was a choice. A silent reminder that she wasn't part of their success story. The ingratitude wasn't in the words, it was in the silence between them. It was the kind of absence that screams. Because Maggie knew what that invitation represented. It was as though someone had erased her past, as if all those years of sacrifice were just a footnote nobody bothered to read. The event sounded grand: exclusive cocktail party, international investors, press coverage. But not a single line thanking the woman who put it all in motion. That invisibility was a velvet-gloved slap. It stung. Severely. She remembered sleepless nights, double shifts, birthdays put on hold for work. Maggie didn't raise her children in luxury, but in presence. She bought their first computer, encouraged them to learn technology. She believed she was building a future. Yet that invitation erased it all. No mention of her emotional support, her advice, the boundaries she set to protect them. Everything forgotten, as if she was just a shadow, always there, but never seen. The irony? The event's theme celebrating the roots of innovation. Roots? What roots grow by ignoring the soil that nourished them? This wasn't just protocol gone wrong. It was emotional betrayal. And Maggie felt it deep in her chest. That sense of being discarded, used, then hidden as if her presence tarnished the image they wanted to project. And to think it all began with a timid request, a quiet conversation in the late afternoon when Ethan said, "Mom, we just need a push." That push cost nearly her entire retirement. Facing that invitation triggered something. For the first time in a long while, Maggie didn't just feel sadness. She felt anger, silent, deep, born from the conviction that injustice had gone too far. This wasn't just about ungrateful children. It was about refusing to let her own legacy be erased. It was about justice. About truth. About confronting what happened to what was denied to happen. She folded the invitation, tucked it into a drawer, and breathed deeply. They will see me, she thought. Some moments in life make confrontation inevitable. Not out of desire to fight, but out of necessity to assert oneself. Maggie had always been discreet, the sort who avoids conflict. Yet something deeply unjust lay in that omission. And sometimes justice begins with a small act: showing up, being present, becoming impossible to ignore. That party would stop being just a celebration. Without them realizing it yet, it would become the stage for truth meeting silence. There, the first step of empowerment was born. Because recognizing that something is wrong is the beginning of change. At that moment, Maggie didn't know how or when, but something inside had awakened. She didn't want revenge. She wanted a voice. She wanted to look her children in the eyes and ask, do you really think any of this would have been possible without me? She wanted to prove for herself, first of all, that no one has the right to rewrite their own story by erasing others. Her legacy would begin to be restored, and that cold invitation would become the spark. But what bothered Maggie most was that this indifference wasn't accidental. It was carefully constructed. Because to erase someone, you first have to choose who will shine alone. And in the version of success Ethan and Emily were selling to the world, there was no room for their widowed mother's sacrifice. No space for the woman who traded her own dreams for diapers, bills, and night shifts. That rewoven story was a betrayal, subtle yet precise, if to say you are no longer part of this. The final straw was seeing the honored names on the invitation: partners, mentors, investors, all listed with prestigious titles. No sign of her. It was like Horizon Innovations had sprouted from thin air, as if Ethan and Emily truly were the self-made heroes the media loved to glorify. But Maggie knew the truth. And truth, no matter how ignored, carries an unbearable weight when confined. Eventually it demands space, attention, its own stage. And Maggie felt that time had come, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. That morning, after placing the invitation back in the drawer, Maggie looked at herself in the mirror. The expression was resolute, her eyes heavy with memories and strength. Her brown hair neatly pinned in a low bun like the hospital days. It reminded her who she was. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about her. For the first time, the thought crossed her mind, what if I go to the event? Not to celebrate with them, but to remind everyone that you cannot build a legacy on another's invisibility. Being remembered isn't vanity, it's restoration. Maggie didn't want to be a hero. She wanted justice. She wanted the world to know that behind every fortune, there are buried stories. And sometimes, those stories decide to rise. Maggie Carter's story didn't begin in a luxurious event hall, but in night shifts, hospital corridors, and cups of reheated coffee. A widow at 37, after her husband Daniel's sudden death, she found herself alone with 2 babies and a mortgage that seemed impossible. Grief gave her no time to breathe. With 2 mouths to feed and no support network, she turned pain into action. She worked double shifts as a nurse, 16 hours a day. Every extra hour was a brick silently placed in her children's future. Life wasn't beautiful, it was functional. While others took vacations, Maggie calculated supermarket pennies. Ethan and Emily grew up with handmade lunchboxes, second-hand clothes, and dignity lessons that came not from speeches, but daily example. And that is where true sacrifice lives, not in grand visible renunciations, but in invisible everyday decisions that shape a life. Choosing between new sneakers or paying for their online course. Giving up a date night to help with homework. But there was never resentment. Maggie did it all with her whole heart. Her love was practical. It showed in hot meals, clean blankets, notes left in lunches. Even when her children grew up and forged their own paths, she expected nothing in return. She only wished for what every mother hopes for, that silent look that says, I see what you did for me. But that look never came. Over time came silence. And with silence, ingratitude took form. There were no fights. No arguments. Just distance. Ethan and Emily gradually stopped visiting on Sundays. Phone calls became rare. Family lunches turned into delayed text messages. And Maggie, once the firm foundation, began to experience invisibility. The kind of pain that doesn't shout, but tightens the chest. She kept telling herself it was normal. That her children were busy. That they had companies to manage. But deep down, she knew something was off in that equation. She felt discarded. The cruelest part was that to everyone else, it seemed Maggie was doing fine. The house tidy. The bills paid. But no one saw the lonely nights. No one knew how often she looked at the door, waiting to hear one of them. Silence was deafening. And when someone praised the success of her children, she smiled. Because pain, when it's still love, hides under pride. But her heart was fractured. How could so much sacrifice be rewarded with such emptiness? That's why confrontation became inevitable, not from anger, but from justice. Because Maggie understood that love without reciprocity becomes pain. And pain without response becomes a shadow that stalks you. She had to understand how everything turned out this way. How two children raised with so much affection and values could treat her like a footnote. Recognition wasn't just a wish, Anna Maria, it was an emotional necessity, a way to rewrite her destiny before it was too late. And what Maggie didn't know is that this feeling of empowerment, of reclaiming her own story, would become the first step towards something much larger. This isn't just her story. It's the story of so many who sacrifice everything and receive silence. Who build legacies without memory. But Maggie was about to change that with courage, with pain, and with truth as her only weapon. What began in hospital corridors was now walking toward a stage where, at long last, the world would hear her voice. It was on a rainy afternoon 6 years ago that Ethan and Emily knocked on their mother's door. They didn't come by often, but that day they arrived together, almost choreographed, just like when they were teenagers asking for something. Maggie made coffee and listened attentively. They were excited, talking about an innovative project, a medical tech startup that would revolutionize the market. They just needed one thing: capital. And then came the Ask 350,000. Maggie's entire life savings. "It's just a boost, Mom. We'll pay you back with interest. You'll be a silent partner." Maggie hesitated. This wasn't just a large amount. It was everything she had saved over a lifetime of sacrifice. Every dollar had a story. Extra shifts. Christmases without gifts. Choosing not to retire when she could. But the spark in her children's eyes moved her. It felt like the culmination of everything she had worked for. "This is why I did it all," she thought. Her heart overruled her reason. And like so many mothers who love unconditionally, she signed the papers, made the transfer, and believed the promises. In the months that followed, the kids stayed in touch. Excited updates, prototypes, meetings. Maggie felt part of Itavan from behind the scenes. She saved their messages, watched their interviews, beaming with pride. But slowly, the contact began to fade. Their responses took longer. Then they barely replied at all. When she asked about the company, their answers were vague. And just like that, she was quietly pushed out. Invisibility returned only now, with a bitter aftertaste, wrapped in broken promises. Eventually, Maggie discovered she had never been formally registered as a partner. The documents she signed were presented as temporary a bridge until the real contract, which never came. The truth began to hurt. They hadn't just taken her money. They had erased her from the company's foundation. Her investment had become an uncomfortable memory for them, something to be buried. It was the deepest betrayal, not just financial, but emotional. Her name didn't even appear in a single note of thanks. This pain was different now. It wasn't just ingratitude, it was manipulation. It was institutionalized disregard. Maggie cried alone for days, feeling deceived by her own children. Justice felt far away. And the shame immense. How do you tell someone you gave everything you had, only to be ignored? It's the kind of story no one wants to admit. But that's when the shift began. Sadness gave way to a strength Maggie didn't know she still had. A kind of empowerment that's born when truth becomes non-negotiable. She didn't want to sue, at least not yet. She just wanted clarity. To know whether what she was feeling was real or if she was overreacting. But every search, every attempt to access information, every cold exchange with her children confirmed it. She had been erased on purpose. And this wasn't just a lapse in character. It was a choice. Confrontation was becoming inevitable, not just for her, but for everyone who's ever been silenced after a sacrifice no one wanted to remember. The injustice was screaming. And Maggie was finally ready to listen. Gradually, the pain turned into purpose. She started taking notes, saving emails, remembering dates. She knew that, if needed, she'd have to prove she wasn't crazy. That there was a truth her children were trying to bury. Her legacy would not be. And if she had to expose the story no one wanted to hear, so be it. Because real strength isn't about staying quiet to keep the peace, it's about speaking up when silence threatens to erase your existence. Maggie was no longer just a mother. She was a survivor of betrayal that needed to be repaired. Silence. That was Maggie's most consistent companion in the years that followed her investment. A sharp silence, one that hurt more than harsh words ever could. Ethan and Emily no longer answered her calls with the same warmth. Her messages were seen, but rarely answered. "Things are crazy, Mom. So much work," they said when they did respond. But Maggie recognized that tone. It was the sound of avoidance. Guilt's disguised voice pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. And she felt it deep in her chest. The invisibility that once stung had now become permanent. Maggie wasn't part of their lives anymore. She was a shadow, an uncomfortable reminder of the beginning of it all. And maybe, a reminder of the moral debt they carried. She stopped insisting. Stopped sending long messages. Started replying only when prompted, and even then, with surgical caution. She didn't want to seem bitter. But the truth was, disappointment had made itself at home. It was like a third person sitting at the table during every solitary meal. In lonely moments, Maggie questioned herself. Had she gone too far protecting them? Loved too much? Should she have demanded more? A mother's mind is cruel when fed by silence. She tried to remember the good times, the Sunday afternoons, the laughter. But betrayal made those memories feel distant, as if they belonged to another life. As if the past had been hijacked by the ingratitude of the present. What should have been a harvest of affection had become barren land. No visits. No fruits. No return. She began avoiding social events. Tired of answering questions about her kids. "They're very busy," she'd say with a weary smile. Inside, frustration ate at her. The legacy she thought she was building didn't seem to have taken root. The emotional justice gratitude that should have come naturally never came. What arrived instead was cruel distance, dressed up as professional success. Maggie saw her children in articles, at events, on panels, always smiling, always grateful to everyone but her. It was during this period that Maggie started writing letters. Not to send, but to unburden. Pages and pages, some full of rage, others of sadness. Many filled with unanswered questions. "Do you remember what I did for you? Was it that easy to erase me? Will you ever understand what real justice means?" Writing became her first act of self-reconnection, of emotional empowerment, of reclaiming her story. Because when no one else hears your voice, the first step is to hear it yourself. The pain that once left her frozen began to turn into movement. Maggie started studying her rights. She read about contracts, investments, silent partnerships. She didn't want revenge, she wanted clarity. She wanted to retrace her steps and understand when trust turned into betrayal. And the more she discovered, the stronger she became. The truth, once foggy, was becoming crystal clear. And with that clarity came the certainty that confrontation was inevitable. But this time, she'd be ready. Not to hurt but to be heard. Because there comes a moment in everyone's life when love can no longer remain passive. When sacrifice must turn into acknowledgement. And with each day of silence, Maggie realized she was moving toward something greater. The legacy she would leave behind wouldn't just be one of resilience but of courage. She wouldn't be remembered as the woman who was forgotten. She would be known as the woman who came back. Who demanded respect. Who raised her voice when others tried to bury it. The silence was still there, but now, it was slowly being replaced by something far more powerful: action. Betrayal hurts when it comes from strangers. But when it comes from within, it shatters. Maggie thought she had already processed the pain that her children's absence and the forgotten investment were the bottom of the well. But she was wrong. The well went deeper. It all started during a casual conversation with Caleb Jenkins, an old family friend and financial advisor. They bumped into each other at a retirees' fair. Over coffee and laughter, he brought up Horizon Innovations, praising the Carter siblings. "One of the most promising investments in my portfolio," he said, casually. Maggie froze. She faked a smile, kept her composure. But inside, her heart pounded like an alarm bell. Caleb had been close to her late husband, Daniel. Had known her children since they were little. And now, he was an investor in the company they'd promised she would be part of? Maggie's head was spinning. If Caleb had access to the company, why had she never been included in anything? Why had she never been invited to meetings, updates, or even basic reports? Her invisibility wasn't just emotional, Anna-Maria, it was financial. They had completely hidden her from the structure of it all. That same day, Maggie began investigating. She searched public records, looked up the company name in databases, read every article old and new. And the more she uncovered, the clearer it became her children had built the entire company without registering her as a participant. The silent partnership had been nothing but words of promise. A verbal agreement with no legal foundation. Caleb, unaware of the full story, still believed Maggie was just another proud onlooker of her children's success. But she wasn't. She was a founder erased. The betrayal hit different now. It was no longer hypothetical, it was confirmed, documented, and cruel. They had used her money as the foundation to build the company. They promised returns, involvement, recognition, and gave her invisibility instead. Maggie felt a mix of fury and humiliation. And again, silence, the old familiar presence settled in. But this time, it didn't paralyze her. It fueled her. She knew she needed allies. She needed evidence. And above all, she had to stop asking why and start focusing on how. 2 days later, she called Caleb. Calmly, she shared part of the story. He was shocked. "You gave them the seed money? And they never listed you as a partner?" he asked, stunned. His outrage was the first sign that Maggie wasn't overreacting. She wasn't alone. Caleb promised to help her review the legal situation, go through the paperwork, and find the right attorney. That was more than friendship, it was the beginning of reconstruction. The first step toward justice. The betrayal was now being confronted with structure, with strategy, and with courage. It was no longer about whether her children deserved forgiveness. It was about what Maggie deserved. Recognition for her sacrifice. Respect for the truth. Reparation for the betrayal. For the first time, she felt in control of her own story. And that feeling of empowerment was new, strong, liberating. The pain was still there, of course. But now, it was accompanied by action. Maggie knew she was about to fight a big battle. But she had faced bigger ones alone before. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. That moment marked a turning point. The confrontation was coming. And it wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be precise, with proof, with presence, with authority. Maggie was no longer just a retired woman with a broken heart. She was someone who knew the truth, who knew her rights, and, more importantly, someone willing to fight for them. Because a legacy isn't just what you leave behind. It's also what you defend. And Maggie was ready to defend hers with every ounce of dignity that had once been denied to her. Maggie's decision was not made in anger. It was made with clarity. The same clarity she had when caring for patients now turned inward, focused on her own case. She knew she couldn't step on a stage carrying only pain in her chest. She needed evidence, strategy, support. So she began organizing everything: bank transfer receipts, old emails, exchanged messages with Ethan and Emily, even a copy of the provisional contract that was never formalized. Every document became a piece in a puzzle, revealing the truth behind the ingratitude. Caleb was essential during this phase. He connected her with attorney Clara Benson, a specialist in corporate law and business ethics. Clara listened in silence, her gaze fixed, expression steady. At the end, she spoke with conviction: "You have a strong case. And more than that, you have a story that needs to be told." That was the turning point. Maggie was no longer merely fighting for justice, she was preparing to expose the truth on a stage they could never have imagined. Their stage, the 5th anniversary celebration of Horizon Innovations. The choice of her dress was almost symbolic. Nothing flashy, but elegant. Deep blue, the color Daniel loved on her. Hair tied back, a discreet necklace, low shoes because Maggie knew she would need to stand firm. In the small inner pocket of her purse lay the documents. In an internal folder, a copy of the complaint, ready to file with the SEC, the regulator of the financial market. But the most important thing was in her mind: courage. The certainty that this was not an act of revenge, but of affirmation. Her legacy wouldn't be buried under neon lights and hollow speeches. In the days preceding the event, Maggie practiced her speech. She didn't want something memorized. She needed to speak from the heart, but without losing composure. She knew she had only a few minutes, and that the moment would demand more than emotion, it would demand presence. With every rehearsal, she felt stronger. The initial anger had transformed into focus. The confrontation was inevitable, but now it came loaded with dignity. She would not beg for recognition. She would claim it. Like someone returning to a place they were never meant to be expelled from. The hardest part was imagining her children's eyes. Maggie knew this act would change everything. That perhaps there would be no turning back. But she also knew she couldn't live with silence. Because their betrayal was not only financial, it was moral. And emotional justice begins when the betrayed person stops staying silent. On the eve of the event, she slept little, but she slept in peace. For the first time in years, she felt she was doing something for herself. Not as a mother. Not as a nurse. But as Maggie Carter, woman, citizen, founder, forgotten and now reborn. She had also prepared letters. One for Ethan, another for Emily. She wasn't sure she would hand them over, but she wanted to make clear that this gesture wasn't destructive. It was restorative. Empowerment doesn't come from hate. It comes from the clarity that some boundaries must never be crossed. And when they are, you must react. With strength, yes, but also with self-respect. Maggie didn't want to bring her children down, she wanted to show the world that the success they celebrated had roots. And that those roots had a name, a face, a story. And blood. On the morning of the event, she looked in the mirror and no longer saw an abandoned woman. She saw a woman ready. With her 73 years of courage, a heart that forgave too much, and a clear mission to make the truth heard. Her legacy would no longer be built in silence. Now it would be shaped by voice, action, and presence. Maggie was going to that party. But not as a guest. As the protagonist. And no one, absolutely no one, could take her out of the center of her own story. The night was clear, the hall decorated like an ode to modernity and success. Everything at Horizon Innovations' 5th anniversary party overflowed with ostentation: LED panels, 3D projections, waiters circulating with crystal trays. Maggie arrived alone, steady steps, attentive eyes. No one recognized her immediately. After all, she had been erased even from the company's memory. She walked slowly, absorbing the environment that somehow existed because of her, yet treated her like a stranger. The feeling of invisibility mixed with a powerful calm. She knew exactly what she was about to do. Ethan and Emily took the stage, applauded by executives and investors. Their speeches were flawless, millimeter-timed. They spoke of vision, innovation, future. They spoke of sleepless nights, financial risks, obstacles overcome. But they didn't mention Maggie. They didn't mention the sacrifice that funded the beginning of everything. It was as if the company had sprung out of nowhere, as if it had been created solely by their genius. That wasn't just ingratitude. It was the deliberate construction of a lie. The denial of an inconvenient truth. The betrayal, once again, happened in silence. When Emily concluded with the phrase, "We are a self-made company," Maggie felt her blood heat up. This was the moment. She walked toward the stage, sidestepping confused glances, turning heads full of astonishment. A security guard tried to intercept her, but Caleb, positioned strategically, intervened. When Maggie climbed up to the stage, an awkward silence filled the hall. Ethan froze. Emily forced a smile. But Maggie was already at the microphone. And with a steady voice, she began, "Good evening. My name is Margaret Carter. And I am the silent root of this company." The impact was immediate. Murmurs spread, phones were raised to record. With documents in hand, Maggie told her story. No exaggeration, no forced tears. Just facts. "I know many invested here believing in a narrative of overcoming. But that narrative has omissions." She revealed bank transfers, message screenshots, the draft contract never formalized. She disclosed the planned SEC complaint, which would be filed if there was no public retraction and an independent audit. It was not blackmail. It was justice. Ethan tried to interrupt but was restrained by a visibly furious investor. Emily was paralyzed. Maggie continued, "I am not here for money. I am here for respect. For the recognition that was denied to me. For a legacy they tried to erase." The room was torn between shock and shame. Some quietly applauded. Others murmured among themselves. The truth, raw and naked, had been placed under a spotlight. There was no turning back. Maggie didn't need approval. She just needed to be heard. The atmosphere of the party shattered like cracked glass. The euphoria gave way to tension. An executive from MedTech, interested in acquiring Horizon, quietly left. Another made an urgent call. The celebratory mood turned into a crisis zone. Maggie's courage had destabilized a structure that seemed unshakable. The confrontation wasn't violent. It was surgical. Precise. A dignified strike amid plastic smiles and empty speeches. The kind of action that transforms not just a night but an entire story. When she stepped off the stage, Maggie didn't smile. But her eyes carried something new: peace. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew invisibility had ended. That her sacrifice had finally been named. And that the truth, though painful, was liberating. For the first time in a long time, Maggie felt that justice was within reach. Not through courts, but through the courage to face everything and everyone. Because in the end, the greatest empowerment is when your own story is reclaimed in your own hands. The impact of Maggie's words was immediate and irreversible. Soon after her speech, investors began exiting the event. Some scrambled to verify the disclosed information, others sent messages to legal teams. The atmosphere turned into dense smoke. The event, once a tribute to self-made success, had become a stage for suspicion, shame, and reputational damage. The director of institutional relations at MedTech, on the brink of signing the $250 million acquisition of Horizon Innovations, cancelled the deal on the spot. The transaction was frozen. The company had lost its mask. Betrayal, now made public, transformed into a legal and commercial wound. Maggie's presence on stage was not just symbolic. It was strategic. With the SEC complaint filed that very night, the agency announced an investigation within 48 hours. Industry media present at the event did not waste time. Headlines like "The Price of Maternal Silence" and "The Woman Erased from Horizon's History" began to circulate. Suddenly, Ethan and Emily were no longer celebrated young entrepreneurs. They had become protagonists of a corporate scandal tinged with family drama. Maggie watched everything calmly. She didn't want humiliation, she wanted justice. Yet seeing the reaction from the press and investors, she grasped the magnitude of what she had done. Her pain, once dismissed as exaggeration, was validated. The invisibility that suffocated her had become news. More than that, it was provoking real change. The SEC demanded immediate access to Horizon's financial records. Independent auditors were appointed. The image of a company built on marketing and ego began to dissolve under the power of truth. Ethan tried to call a press conference to deny the facts. But a major investor interrupted him, demanding the board's immediate resignation, including both siblings. Emily, visibly shaken, could no longer sustain her rehearsed narrative. For the first time, they seemed like children again, exposed, powerless, standing before a greater authority. But that authority was reality itself. The company, which had grown on the sacrifice of a forgotten woman, now had to face the consequences of its illegitimate foundations. Truth has a cruel way of asserting itself, it doesn't ask permission. The confrontation Maggie began on stage didn't end there. It reverberated in boardrooms, contract clauses, and civil and criminal liability terms. A preliminary audit uncovered serious ethical breaches in the company's formation. MedTech publicly backed out, citing structural inconsistencies and violations of transparency principles. Horizon's downfall was no longer a question of if, but when. And it all started with a woman who chose not to stay silent. Maggie remained composed. She did not give interviews. She didn't pose for photos. She declined talk show invitations. Her fight was intimate, quiet, ethical. It was for justice, not fame. Caleb managed communication with the attorney, and together they followed developments with prudence. Maggie knew many would try to misrepresent the facts, painting her courage as vengeance. But she also understood that truth doesn't need applause, only space. And now she had more than space. She had voice. That night marked the moment a woman, once erased by ingratitude and betrayal, reclaimed her place. Not through scandal, but through truth. Maggie's empowerment became a beacon for mothers, forgotten workers, anyone used and discarded. The legacy she defended was real and concrete. Justice was beginning. And even without an immediate happy ending, there was something far greater: the end of silence. And the start of a new story, written by her. The world seemed quieter after the storm. The media, saturated with scandals, moved on. But Maggie Carter continued living the aftermath of the night. She decided to reclaim her story. Horizon Innovations entered full restructuring. Her children were removed from executive control. A legal team managed mediation between investors and founders. Ethan and Emily tried to hold appearances, but the narrative had shifted. Now, they were known not only for the products they built, but for the mother they tried to erase. A few days later, Emily showed up at Maggie's home. She looked drained, dark circles under her eyes, smeared makeup from a failed attempt to keep composure. She cried at the door, asked to come in. Maggie, with a heart both gentle and guarded, let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one years ago, where they had drawn plans, shared dreams, and vowed partnership. Emily apologized, but not out of love. Out of desperation. "If you withdraw the complaint, maybe the sale can still be saved," she said. Maggie didn't answer. She simply looked at her daughter with a mix of compassion and disappointment. The manipulation was clear. They wanted the benefit, without the truth. They wanted her back as a silent background figure. Maggie rose, reached for one of the letters she had written weeks before, and handed it to Emily. "This is all I needed to say." Emily read in silence, tears falling slowly. Then she got up and left. No hug. No reconciliation. Because for Maggie, forgiveness now had to follow justice, not precede it. And justice was still underway. In the following days, Maggie was advised not to seek exposure. Yet her story had already spread. She received letters from other women, mothers, former partners, people forgotten after giving their all. Some wrote to say thank you. Others poured out their pain. She read every message. She replied when she could. And gradually, she realized her struggle was bigger than Shed imagined. She hadn't just recovered her voice. She had inspired others to find theirs. Empowerment had become a movement. Caleb, who until then had been a discreet support, began visiting Maggie's home more frequently. They shared meals, exchanged stories, found peace in the mundane. He understood what Shed endured. More than that, he respected the strength she displayed. There was no romance between them, not yet. But there was partnership. Someone who saw her not as invisible, but essential. And for Maggie, that was healing. Life slowly returned, but with dignity. She no longer had to prove anything to anyone. Horizon, in turn, underwent full reform. New management announced policies on compliance, transparency, and review of old contracts. Maggie's name was officially added to the founder's board and recognized in public records. A portion of future profits was secured in her name. But strangely, money no longer held the same importance. The real value was being seen, heard, acknowledged, not as a footnote, but as a pillar. Her sacrifice had finally come out of the shadows. The silence between Maggie and her children remained. Perhaps forever. But she no longer cried over that silence. Because sometimes, the greatest form of love is letting go. And the greatest form of healing is knowing your worth even if others never acknowledge it. The confrontation had been won not because someone fell but because she stood. Now, with peace in her gaze and truth by her side, Maggie was ready to live the rest of her life in fullness. Not as the forgotten woman, but as the woman who rewrote her own legacy. Time passed, but the impact of what Maggie had done continued to echo. There were no grand headlines afterward, no public tributes. But there was transformation. And in the end, that's what builds a legacy. Horizon Innovations was forced to restructure not just its leadership, but its very essence. The story of the woman who had been erased and who had the courage to reclaim her place began circulating in corporate backchannels, ethics lectures, and university classrooms. Not as a scandal, but as an example of silent yet powerful justice. Maggie never spoke to Ethan or Emily again. And strangely, that was liberating. She realized that the most important recognition isn't from others, it's from yourself. She no longer saw herself as the rejected mother. She was a woman who knew when to stop giving and start demanding. And that changed everything. Her empowerment wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud. It was steady. It was honest. And above all, it was built on the understanding that truth can be delayed but never erased. Her name, now, was part of the story. With part of what she was owed finally secured, Maggie chose to use the money simply. She renovated her home, made a small donation to a community center where she had worked for years, and created a scholarship in her late husband's name, Daniel Carter. She didn't want monuments. She wanted continuity. Something that represented the real legacy of someone who plants even without knowing if they'll see the harvest. And now, she did. For the first time, with wide-open eyes, free from illusions. Caleb, now more present than ever, became part of her daily life. They shared gardening, breakfast, daytime TV shows. Nothing spectacular, but everything deeply genuine. And maybe that was the greatest gift. After so much sacrifice, betrayal, and pain, she had found peace. Not by becoming a hero, a martyr, or a victim. Just by being herself. A woman who loved too much. Who trusted too much. But who, at the right moment, knew how to rise and make herself heard. Maggie's story became a source of inspiration. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. How many other women, how many parents, how many professionals live in silence after being erased by those they helped lift? How many stories of sacrifice turned to dust without even a thank you? Maggie didn't let that happen to her. And because of that, her story gained meaning for others. The recognition she had longed for didn't come through applause. It came through identification, through connection, through impact. Because the most powerful legacy isn't the one that appears in the press. It's the one that lives in people's hearts. It's when someone hears your story and says, "Me too." It's when a woman decides to no longer accept invisibility. When a man decides to no longer swallow ingratitude. When someone understands that confrontation is sometimes the most just way to love yourself. Maggie didn't aim to destroy. She aimed to rebuild. And she succeeded. With dignity. With truth. With courage. And in the end, one clear lesson remained, one she repeated softly to herself every time she looked in the mirror: love without justice is just invisible sacrifice. And no one deserves to be erased from their own story. Maggie Carter, with her steady voice and her quietly unbreakable presence, reminds us there is power in being seen. And above all, there is power in not giving up on yourself. And now that you know this story, tell me, how many Maggies do you know? How many people gave their time, their energy, their money, their support only to be discarded when they were no longer useful? Maybe that person is you. Maybe you've lived something similar, gave your love, believed in promises, carried the weight of the world on your shoulders. And in the end your name wasn't even mentioned. You didn't get a thank you, or a nod, or even a look back. That's the kind of sacrifice no one sees. Because it doesn't come with fireworks. It happens in silence. When you pay a bill that isn't yours, when you lend money you can't afford to lose, when you listen without being heard, when you show up and still get ignored. That's invisible sacrifice. And the world is full of it. But there comes a moment, an invisible line, where pain turns into clarity. When the wound becomes strength. When betrayal no longer paralyzes you, it pushes you forward. And Maggie reached that point. She realized she could no longer wait for recognition from those who refused to see her. So she went after it herself. And hey, race the part that might matter most to you right now. You can do that too. You don't need a stage, or microphones, or a corporate scandal. The confrontation that matters most doesn't happen in front of cameras. It happens inside you. When you decide to stand up from the chair they put you in. When you stop accepting less than you deserve. When you understand that loving others can't mean stopping the love for yourself. And I'm not saying it's easy. Or fast. But I promise you it's possible. Maggie started with small steps. Writing letters. Gathering evidence. Drinking tea alone and deciding that day, she wouldn't swallow it in silence anymore. That's how it started. And maybe that's how it begins for you too. And if this story touched you, if you saw yourself in it, or thought of someone who needs to hear this, do one thing for me. Share it. Show this video to someone who's lived the pain of being erased. Leave a comment below telling us what it meant to you. We read every word. We respond. And more than that, we build together a space where no one needs to be a hero to be respected. If you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. Click the button. Turn on notifications. Because here, we tell stories that move, challenge, and remind you of what matters most. You matter. Even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. And before we end, I leave you with one question Maggie asked herself at 73, and maybe it's time you ask yourself too. Am I letting myself be erased because I'm afraid to be seen? If the answer is yes, maybe it's time to change.